research. And, it's partly because part of our mandate here at MetaViews is to popularize research. We like to find some of the interesting technology research, policy, democratic research, and popularize it, make it accessible. And so today's topic is the notion of privacy harms. And in the policy world, everything's driven by harms, right? If people are getting hurt, we have to protect them. If someone is being impinged upon or bullied or picked on, especially in a corporate context, well, maybe there's an opportunity for a lawsuit there or liability. But the problem with the digital world is it's hard to establish harms, right? It's hard to articulate why Facebook is harmful. Because on the surface, Facebook looks pretty superficial. Facebook looks like it's just people chatting. And it's taken several years for researchers to articulate what the harms of Facebook are, both in the privacy sense, but also in the addiction, or also in the way in which people impact each other. So, I kind of wanted to use this paper, both Ken, to get your thoughts on the way in which harms are articulated or the way in which they're framed, but also because this is another one of those active, persistent threads on MetaViews. And that, as we get better at articulating what these harms are, it then makes it easier for us to explain why Facebook is rotten, or to explain why some technologies have to be used in moderate ways or in reasonable ways. So I wanted to look at this paper that comes from an amazing scholar, Danielle Citrin. And Danielle Citrin is really one of the leading scholars when it comes to the way in which privacy, but also technology, intersects with the law. And this, I'll read the abstract, but the purpose of this research is to really establish why we need privacy and why we need privacy laws, because of the harms that come when we don't have privacy. So allow me to read this. Privacy harms have become one of the largest impediments in privacy law enforcement. In most tort and contract cases, plaintiffs must establish that they have been harmed. Even when legislation does not require it, courts have taken it upon themselves to add a harm element. Harm is also a requirement to establish standing in federal court. In Spokio versus Robbins, the U.S. Supreme Court has held that courts can override Congress's judgments about what harm should be cognizable and dismiss cases brought for privacy statute violations. So to translate, what they mean here is that if there's no harm, if there's no way to prove that someone has been harmed, then there's no legal action possible. And with privacy, because it's kind of invisible, right? Because digital data is so hard to identify, it's made it really difficult for harm to actually be impacted. And, a quick throw to the chat, LeBessier has pointed out that they've been talking about this for over a decade. And absolutely, that is what's so frustrating about this, that it's why the courts, it's why the laws have taken so long to catch up. So to continue reading this abstract, the case law is an inconsistent, incoherent jumble with no guiding principles. Countless privacy violations are not remedied or addressed on the grounds that there have been no cognizable harm. Courts conclude that many privacy violations, such as thwarted expectations, improper uses of data, and the wrongful transfer of data to other organizations, lack cognizable harm. So this is when, Facebook sells all of our data. Judges say, well, there's no harm there, so there's nothing wrong with Facebook doing it. And that's why these harm examples are so important to articulate. So courts struggle with privacy harms because they often involve future uses of personal data that vary widely. When privacy violations do result in negative consequences, the effects are often small: frustration, aggravation, and inconvenience, and dispersed amongst a large number of people. When these minor harms are done at a vast scale by a large number of actors, they aggregate into more significant harms to people and society. But again, these harms do not fit well with existing judicial understandings of harm. So this article makes two central contributions. And here's the part, Ken, that I kind of want to get your response. The first is the construction of a roadmap for courts to understand harm so that privacy violations can be tackled and remedied in a meaningful way. Privacy harms consist of various different types, which to date have been recognized by courts in inconsistent ways. The authors set forth a typology of privacy harms that elucidate why certain types of privacy harms should be recognized. The second contribution in this paper is providing an approach to when privacy harm should be required. In many cases, harm should not be required because it is relevant to the purpose of the lawsuit, and currently much privacy litigation suffers from a misalignment of law enforcement goals and remedies. For example, existing methods of litigating privacy cases, such as class actions, often enrich lawyers but fail to achieve meaningful deterrence. Because the personal data of tens of millions of people could be involved, even small actual damages could put companies out of business without providing much of value to each individual. The authors contend that the law should be guided by the essential question, when and how should privacy regulation be enforced, and they offer an approach that aligns enforcement goals with appropriate remedies. And so, to be clear, what the authors are doing is, on the one hand, they're arguing, look, there's a lot of harm to privacy, and we need to recognize those harms so that we motivate the court, so that we motivate politicians to take action. But they're also saying, in some cases, harm doesn't really matter. That in some cases, the privacy violation is so far in the future in terms of its implications that we shouldn't worry about harm. We should still punish the companies that violate those privacies without fetishizing or focusing on the role that harm plays in that. So that took me a little bit of while, Ken, to kind of parse out that abstract. But, this is another area that I know you're quite active. And even though you're not a lawyer, you are the son of a lawyer. So, by extension, I think you certainly appreciate the role that law plays in technology and mitigating some of the negative impacts of technology. So with that said, I'm curious how you respond both to the notion of privacy harms, but the arguments made in this paper that the courts should rethink their relationship to the concept of harms, especially in the context of privacy. Oh, hold on. Sorry, I had you on mute because you were typing when I started. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. Yeah, this is tricky because this is the unlawful transfer of information, and you're trying to retain a domain in which the information was originally produced, which keeps it private to the expected broadcast area, and leaking it outside of that original area. And the leaking itself to the outside is the harm, not, as you're saying, not the demonstrable physical harm, as you're saying, or possibly some symbolic harm like the number in your bank account going lower because someone used your private information to defraud you. Though that would be much more provable, so it's actually not quite a great example. But yes, I think that we might be fighting a bit of a losing battle if you look at David Gelernter's pretty well-known book, Mirror Worlds, where he talks about a world with no privacy at all, and just the realignment of what our expectations of privacy and more like our whole culture of what is private and what is not. In fact, nothing is private at that point, where everybody just gets used to the lack of privacy and nothing is interesting because there's so much, as I would say, there's so much signal that it's the indexing of this information which becomes more valuable. We already have that already with public information, that if the information is public, it almost doesn't matter. It's whether it's been indexed by Google or other search engines, which makes it valuable because there's so much information. So we could be fighting a losing battle as all these, it's one thing to have a privacy policy from a company for your Internet of Things devices that are all over your house. And it's another because you bought from a company and they got hacked and now everybody's information has now been leaked out. Just as we've seen so many hacks of Yahoo and Sony and so many other companies where all people's private information is leaked out. There's really no way to protect yourself other than to never produce the information in the first place, which is also difficult, right? It's not just that you can protect it by not giving the information away. That's a losing battle. I'm trying to do that with phone numbers where people are, I'm signing up for the smallest business for, getting my dry cleaning. I have to use the website. And if I put my phone number in there, well, that's now aggregated into some larger database and it's hacked next week. and now I get endless Bitcoin scam calls from CRA because my number's in their list. It's basically impossible. So the only way to do it is to not produce the information in the first place. And that puts a huge onus on people to not live their lives by not producing information, identifiable information. It's very, very tricky. So I think we should try to protect as much as we can going forward, that the damage is the leak, not the demonstrable financial or other physical, social, or psychological impacts or financial impacts, but that the leak itself is the problem. And we should have privacy laws that are just applied just as strenuously as tax laws are, though that might not be a great example either.
No, but I think it's fair, because I think if the government took our privacy as seriously as the government takes their revenue, i.e. our taxes, then I think we would be in a better position in terms of mitigating our privacy. I'm a big fan of policies like privacy by default, in which you mandate that companies like Facebook have all their privacy settings turned on, and that you have to actually then opt in to the surveillance and opt into the ad tracking. But I waffle between, cynicism that privacy is dead and optimism that technology has a role in protecting our privacy. When I think privacy is dead, I start focusing on radical transparency and the way we can have transparent systems that still serve democracy and serve to limiting the power of big corporations and big governments. But I'm curious, before we sort of pivot off this topic, whether you think that there's an opportunity for technology to protect our privacy. And, I do want to talk about something that Nuvayak just mentioned in the chat, which is surveillance, right? Which was our old fellow traveler Steve Mann's idea that we could watch the watchers. So if you want to sort of bring that into the notion, Ken, of whether technology could reclaim our privacy. And I think the example of the phone number is perfect. Because when I moved out to the country, I had to get a landline, right? Because cell phone service is so spotty, it's unreliable. And we wanted to be able to, in an emergency, make a phone call. But our landline is useless, right? We don't answer the phone because every single phone call we get is a scam or, bullshit. And I never make calls on it either because no one I know is going to pick up their phone. So I keep wondering, why am I paying for this stupid $100 Bell landline? I mean, it goes to the point of our trending topic here, Bell Let's Cut. I should be cutting that landline, so obviously. But, I mean, very briefly, Ken, do you feel that there's an opportunity for technology to protect or preserve our privacy? And similarly, is there, if not to protect our privacy, a role for technology in this constant cyber war we face with all the marketers in the world who are constantly trying to invade our space and capture our attention? Thank God for Pi-hole and other ad blocking technologies. But nonetheless, I mean, to what extent is there an ongoing cat and mouse game between us and the people who are surveilling us?
Well, obviously there is. Marketers and advertisers do want to get at our information. They're doing a terrible job, though, because we're a very small example. We're watching Baroness von Sketch last night, a comedy show from Toronto, which is kind of like the a lot gayer or a lot more lesbian, lot older, 40s, Toronto-centric female comedy troupe who are amazing, that they take all sorts of social tropes and do comedy skits. And I'm watching this, and it's a very progressive show. Then they show me a Ford F-350 truck ad on YouTube right next. Actually, no, it was on CBC. Like, no one in that audience is going to be buying a Ford F-350. And I mean, that's just me watching that show. They could have, collected lots of information on me and been marketing routers or Wi-Fi access points or something to me that I would be more likely to buy. So they're doing a bad
to your
job.
point, yeah, that is a classic case of algorithmic error, right? Where Ford bid so much money on that ad that they overrode the programming logic and are hitting the wrong audience, and it's therefore a waste of money.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's the problem with this information. You can't control where it flows and where it's going to be used. They just have the fact that I'm watching a YouTube stream, so I get an ad, and that's it. They get my information. They might use it for future, and find out that, I'm looking at electric cars and I might start getting actual electric car ads, which might actually honestly be useful. But that doesn't seem to be it. The bigger threat that I see is that all these companies are collecting this information, not protecting it, and people who do know how to use it properly, which seems to be hackers, are the ones who hackers and people who want to channel your vote in a certain direction. Those seem to be the two groups that are actually pretty good at using this private information. And we see a lot more of what you're talking about in that article, where the privacy violation is distributed so widely that, number one, there's no remedy, because if the company goes bankrupt, everybody gets, $8. Or number two, where the harm is so insignificant that people can't be bothered in fixing it. For example, I had a credit card a long time ago where I was getting a $9 a month charge and we could not identify it. Now, how much time am I going to spend on a $9 a month charge? But apparently, I read an article a few years later. I just canceled the card, but a few years later, I read an article that there was hundreds of thousands of these charges going on. So whoever was doing this was getting $900,000 a month. It's very, very lucrative. Now, of course, that represents at least $900,000 plus the time of people spending on the bank, using up their time and their own time and lost productivity dealing with this bullshit. So we're looking at, like $2 million a month of community harm, which is not easily reclaimable. Now, as for technology being enabling us to control our privacy, well, yeah, there's some pretty simple things. It's amazing to me that cell phone companies, which used to protect their airtime so long ago, as part of your contract, that if you really wanted any usable airtime, you had to get up into the $60, $70, $80 contracts. Now no one cares, because the whole ecosystem has been destroyed by these spam callers that no one even bothers using the phone anymore. It would be very simple to get off a phone number based system, because that's all it is an indexing system of how to get to the specific person. It could be, like with VoIP, you can use name at address, like an email address. But even with email, people are asking for email addresses. Well, it's been very simple, and it's been around since the 80s, that you add a plus or some other symbol into your email address, and everything after the plus is ignored, and only the first part of your email address is legitimate. What that does is it allows you to, on the fly, create email addresses off the top of your head, and I've trained my wife to even do that. But of course, a lot of the providers are like, well, you're shopping with, say, Sale, an outdoor gear provider, and she's like, well, my email address is regular part of the email address _sale.ca, and then they try to put it in the system. They're like, no, we're not allowed to put that. That seems like an employee email address, right? So we have to invent something random. But for most people, the way that these Bitcoin scams, the spray and pray ones, where they say, I've seen you doing stuff on your computer and I have the video, and if you don't give me Bitcoin, I'll popularize that video to all your contacts. Well, that's a bullshit email. Obviously, we know that. And the only reason it works is because everybody else has one email address. Whereas I can see it's coming to my MySpace email, which I, of course, haven't used in a decade or really ever. And I know that it was because MySpace got hacked. So that's a way that I use technology to protect myself, that I give every email address that I give out is specific to the person I'm giving it. And then if it gets spammed or hacked, I know where it came from, and I can just, spam can it or delete it, right?
Well,
so that kind of thing.
And I think that illustrates another recurring kind of thread that we have on MetaViews, which is literacy is what fundamentally mitigates privacy harms, right? The greater your literacy, the greater your ability to use these tools, the less likely you are to be taken advantage of. But to your point, you're still going to lose your data, right? Your email address is still going to end up in the scammer's database, your phone numbers. I got into a huge fight with my pharmacist recently because they won't email. And I pointed out that at least with email, I have a spam filter. At least with email, I can whitelist addresses versus the phone system. I don't have anywhere near that level of programmability. So maybe we should discard those phone numbers. Maybe we do need to go to a kind of digital and email based, Discord, for example, having a username. I think we are moving towards that, but it just speaks to the power of monopolies like Bell and why #Bell Let's